Looks like we're going to have to go full-on woke with Martha's Vineyard. And I mean full-on woke. You have to tear down every image of Martha's Vineyard, anything referring to Martha's Vineyard. Because as it turns out, ladies and gentlemen, going after one of the holy grails or enclaves of the left here, as it turns out, Martha's Vineyard has quite the history when it comes to slavery and segregation. And I found these two articles of the New York Times going back to 2005 that talk about this book by Jill Nelson. Well, one of the articles is an excerpt from the book. The other is a review of the book. Now, the review was done by Geraldine Brooks at the New York Times. But I'm going to share some excerpts from both. But first, let me give you a brief history of Martha's Vineyard. So before 1642, the area was inhabited by the Wampanoag tribe, which had a population of 3,000 or so. But after European settlement, and by 1764, the population dwindled down to 313 natives, members of the Wampanoag tribe. Now, Martha's Vineyard was purchased by Thomas Mayhew, who bought it from two Englishmen, and the surrounding areas like Nantucket. And while it's true that Thomas Mayhew had really good relations with the Wampanoag tribe, and that Martha's Vineyard had one of the first deaf communities in the country, the fact remains they had slavery. It was a predominantly Puritan settlement. So let me get into these two articles here at the New York Times. Now, the first one is from the book itself, Finding Martha's Vineyard. And it says here, records of a black presence on the vineyard, slave, escaped slave, or free are scant. But it is likely that, as elsewhere, slaves came with the earliest European settlers or not far behind. What records were kept and still exist concerning the African American presence on the vineyard prior to emancipation indicate that the numbers were small. Much of this information comes from the wills of white vineyard residents, some of whom left slaves as property to their heirs. These records indicate that slave ownership by the vineyard residents was small, consisting of between 1 and 4 slaves to a family, with probably fewer than 50 slaves on the island at any one time. So we got to start taking down these statues or anything that has to do with Martha's Vineyard. We have to do it. We have to go full on woke here. Beat the left at their own game. According to a document from 1765, 46 blacks lived on Martha's Vineyard, although it is not clear how many were slaves or free. It is also likely that some African Americans, slave or free, married into the Wampanoag community, were adopted by the tribe, and did not appear on any official records. Oh, but it gets better, folks. It gets better. In a will probated in 1770, property listed included, and this is her wording here, quote, 1 Negro woman, 2 boys, 60 pounds. According to an essay by island summer resident Jacqueline L. Holland, whose grandmother, Phoebe Mosley, first came to the vineyard in 1883 as governess, housekeeper, and cook for a white family, quote, the estate of Samuel Sarson, Governor Thomas Mayhew's grandson, who died August 24, 1703, included a Negro woman valued at 20 pounds, perhaps the earliest documented evidence of a slave presence on Martha's Vineyard. The federal census in 1790, encompassing the island towns of Tisbury, Egderton, and Chilmark, the towns of West Tillsbury, Gayhead, and Oak Bluffs did not exist yet, specify white males and females and list only a total of 27 people described as free persons. It is reasonable to assume that these free persons include Native American members of the indigenous Wampanoag tribe and people of African descent as well. So slavery on Martha's Vineyard. Take any symbol of Martha's Vineyard down. In fact, take down the Massachusetts state flag or the Martha's Vineyard community flag. What is clear is that black, slave-free, or indentured servants were either not counted, undercounted, or listed vaguely in the early census. This is in the New York Times. I am surprised that the New York Times even published this, but this is from this book by Jill Nelson. Again, this article from 2005, August 7th of 2005. Title of the book, Finding Martha's Vineyard. Talking about race relations, growing up in Gayhead, segregation, the history of slavery. But as late as 1995, you had a little racial strife at Martha's Vineyard. So let me get to the review of this book, which is by Geraldine Brooks, if I didn't mention it earlier. And she says here about Nelson. Nelson came out with a memoir called Voluntary Slavery, pretty much mimicking what's in the book here. Nelson is lolling as a porch rocker when evoking the special charms of the vineyard. She describes the many familiar rituals of a summer place, recalling the smells of a musty house, closed for winter, opening at last to the inrush of honeysuckle-scented salt air. She makes you feel the cling of a bathing suit worn all day and the delicious briny flavor of the season's first lobster. And then, just when you are nodding and smiling, complacent in the pleasures of shared memories, she jolts you. For the experience of African Americans on the vineyard, it is not in the end the same as that of whites. Consider the journey. For her family, it always started just after midnight, with her mother's voice husky and insistent. Nelson would huddle beneath the covers, sluggish and unwilling, until her mother said, quote, "We do not want to miss the ferry." Ferry meaning that magic word to Martha's Vineyard. Martha's Vineyard means summer. She writes that it took her almost 40 years to realize that it wasn't necessary to drive from New York City to the ferry dock in Woods Hole in the darkness. And what her parents were trying to do with 4 children was trying to avoid, in the 1950s, problems of racism and segregation. So here it talks about Nelson's memoir, Voluntary Slavery, which examined her time at the Washington Post. She doesn't shy from discussing the subtle manifestations of racism that endure even on the vineyard. The hostile reactions to an influx of black college students on the July 4th weekend in 1995 was an in Arcadia echo moment for many vineyards. But this is, in the end, a gentle and optimistic book. Quote, "It is both ironic and fitting," Nelson writes, "that is to this island in the Atlantic Ocean, the same ocean that brought our ancestors to the New World in slave ships, that so many black Americans come each summer to lay their burdens down. That the waters that brought the most profound oppression can, centuries later, provide no small measure of freedom." And Geraldine Brooks wrote a book called March, a Novel. So these 2 articles at the New York Times talking about the slave history, the racial history of Martha's Vineyard. We have to rename Martha's Vineyard. We have to do it. They kicked out migrants. Pardon me. They kicked out migrants. Doing this one take again. They kicked out migrants, and they have this history of slavery and segregation. Granted, we don't have those things now, just like you don't have slavery and segregation now in the South. But anything referring to the South, it has to come down. Anything referring to George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, has to come down. In fact, we should rename Washington, D.C. We should rename Washington, D.C. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, you know what to do. You can also find me at Instagram, #JasonComposes. Follow me at Twitter, Cultural Confederacy at Twitter. Thought I'd share this with you tonight, but after this debacle with these migrants and all this talk of taking down these statues, I think it's time to give the left a dose of their own medicine. What do you think? Let me know in the comment section below. This is the Cultural Confederacy saying peace out. Stay safe, everybody. God bless this great country, and I'll catch you next time.